Mixing with Mike, plugin of the week is the TC Electronic VSS3. TC Electronic has now released in native form a plugin that only existed in the Power Core and old HD systems for Pro Tools that required the HD Pro Tools processing, independent processing. So now available in native form. You can get this in all of the current audio plugin formats. And essentially, it's a really amazing reverb that's largely based off of the System 6000 reverb, which is a hardware digital reverb unit, very high-end, used in many, many studios, professional studios, and highly regarded. What I like most about the TC electronic reverb in this specific one is that it has like a very unique smoothness to the tail, which is sort of a signature part of the reverb sound. And it's that uniqueness and character has drawn a lot of people to the hardware device, and also people who have stuck with a plugin who are still maintaining older HD systems or have the TC Power Core system. Now in native form, of course, this brings it off to anyone who wants to go off and buy the plugin, and this is a really amazing reverb. So let's kind of go through some of the basic sections here. We have the basic sections here are the main section. We can have presets right here. This will just enable or disable the tooltips. I'll turn that off. We have a separate section for early reflections, for reverb, for modulation of all that. We can bypass the plugin. And then we have a fader assigned, which is kind of cool because what you can do here is you can assign specific parameters here to any of these 6 things. So this sort of represents loosely the individual sliders that you would have. So very much if you look at the design of their remote control, it has a series of what looks like little faders that control all the parameters, and then you kind of page through them. And that's kind of what we're getting here, more or less, only in plugin form. Another cool feature here, which you don't see in all the plugins, is the ability, because it'll open up pretty small, but you can stretch it out to a nice size, which also is great for demoing. And then you can toggle through plugins or look through presets. When you go through presets, you have a series of factory presets. You have some that are specific to music, so you can look for vocal, room, plates, instruments, etc. You have ones that are set up specifically for film. So these get into small spaces. So this is really good for doing audio work in film, post-production work, where you need all different size spaces, everything from inside cars and garages and all of that sort of stuff. And so you can do those spaces. And if you go to the little asterisk here, it'll actually show all of the available presets, so you can kind of go through and open up any of those on your own independently. So I'm just starting here with a small wood room. I have a drum kit set up, and I'm going to kind of go through some sounds. But let's start by working with some of the basic controls. So what I'm going to do here, and it's really great because it's a recommendation, something that I've always done, and when I looked through the manual just to kind of double check and look through the settings, I found that they recommend the same exact thing, which is to basically turn off the reverb level and then turn up the early level and start with the early reflections. And this is a great place where you can select the type of space that you're working in, and then get on to setting up the fundamental size of the reverb that we have. So here we have, I'll just play the drums initially without the reverb, and then I'll add it in. So this has a room track, but it's relatively low. So what I have here is fundamentally the skeleton of a space, more or less. So the early reflections are the reflections that come off the wall, ceiling, the floor, ceiling, and walls, and return back to the listening position or back to the original position. And so what you get from that is you get this sense of size of the space, right? And so what they've done here is they've set up a bunch of early types, so you can go through a whole different series of them. There's quite a lot of them here that you can kind of go through, everything from phone booths and out on the street, etc. There's like car parks and all kinds of stuff like that. And so what I started off here was with a studio setup, and churches, theaters, concert halls. We can go through a few. All right, so that'd be a live venue, studio. And initially, right, that would be a very close-up kind of thing. Right, so and all of those things that would be like a really great one, maybe for a vocal, to pull a vocal really up front. I'm going to start with the studio space here. The idea there was just to show you how you can set kind of the skeleton of the space, and really what you want to do now is set the size. Right, so now you can hear like the. Now we're not going to leave it this loud, but we could decide like how we want. Do you want to make this a tight space, medium space, or a large space? I'm going to go with a small space, keep it kind of intimate, and then just use this to create a little bit of presence. Now, there's also a thing here called color, and primarily what the color is doing is kind of setting the spectral balance of the high frequencies. Which is a little bit different than like an EQ, a lot bit different than EQ. So I can set the basic tonal coloration. I can also shift the balance left or right. Right now it's center, so I could lean the reflections more toward one side or the other. Sometimes that's really cool for an effect where, say, you have a guitar on one side and you have the effect over to the other side, and you can get kind of the echoes just to kind of show off the space a little bit or create some sense of depth. So there's early, so you get this basic early setup. Now, what we could do from here now is bring up the reverb, and then we'll be able to kind of balance this in, because this is not going to be up all the way, but we can start. But once we've established that size, if you don't establish that early level or kind of find something that's really suitable in terms of the size space that you want to put it in, if you do that first, let me just go the other approach. What'll happen is when you create the reverb, however you want to shape it, it'll sound right. And now you can kind of color it and play around with it and do whatever you want. So I'm actually going to leave this in, but I'm going to kind of bring it back here a little bit, and then. So the reverb without it. All right, so overall, that's loud, but I can get a sense for what it's like with and without. And sometimes that's best in a place where it's just at a point where you kind of feel it, where you get the sense of the space and let the reverb do more of the work. So now if I go to the main page, I can get some of the basic parameters here. So in other words, I could set my basic decay, have a reverb delay, and a pre-delay. The difference is that the pre-delay sets a delay for the input signal going into the reverb. So in other words, the early reflections will be delayed by this as well. If I just have a reverb delay, then the early reflections will appear first, which is more natural to the space, and then you could delay the reverb tail, or the back end of it. There's also a high cut and a high decay rate. So what this does, this is kind of an interesting thing. So what the high cut does is it starts to cut frequencies above this point here, let's say 3.2K. But what this does is it changes the decay rate by a percentage. So in other words, what we could do is it's like a multiplier, essentially. So by changing that, we can actually change the shape. We can actually increase it. So we can essentially increase signal above that, or we can decrease signal above that. And it's kind of more like a reverb time kind of aspect to it. It's actually, that's not what it is. It's kind of like multiplying the amount above or below the selected frequency, the high cut frequency, more or less. Okay, so we have that there. We have our reverb and early reflection levels. We have a dry level, which is off. We can even lock that into place, which is really cool. So you can take any feature and you can lock it if you're going to make sure that you don't change it, or if you work through presets. and stuff like that. You can keep the dry level off in case some of them are set up in more of an insert mode as opposed to a send return mode, the way I have it configured here. And we could leave the input and output level alone for this. Let's go on to the reverb. Now, when we go to the reverb, there are a variety of different shapes. So actually, let's go back here for a second and let's just kind of set. We could do it here right from the main menu here, from the bar here. I'm going to start here. It's a little bit long, but you're going to see how we'll be able to tailor this when we get here. So let's talk about the reverb type. So for this, depending upon the type of sound, we could get a variety of different colorations. Faster reverb that's wide. Live and wide. Here we can change the width. So here we have a lot of different ways that we can kind of shape the reverb tail. It's basically the shape of the tail and the way that the reflections kind of build in the space. And more or less it's like about the shape of the space, not just the sort of cubic footage of the space, if you want to look at it from that perspective. We also have a low cut and a low damp. So this is just the amount we're attenuating below the selected frequency. Similar type of thing here, so we can soften the top end. Right, so we could take that if it's a little bit harsh. The soften control really helps to bring down some of the harshness or tame some of the harshness. We also have a diffusion. So this is like a density, like how dense, how many reflections are kind of occurring at that point. So we can add, like, in this case, I think we're going to be leaning a little bit more towards a dense sound just to give a little power in there. But if we want a little bit more openness, we can bring the diffusion down to kind of open it up. And again, we could balance the reverb left, right. That's an unusual setting that you don't see in a lot. Most people would do it on the return, but to do it within the plugin is kind of cool. This is where we got a lot of the power of the plugin, because here what we have is basically 4 zones here: low decay, low mid decay, high mid decay, and high decay, and 3 crossover points. And essentially what you're getting with here is you have the ability, using a multiplier, to adjust the reverb time relative to the total time. So if we have a decay of 810 milliseconds, I can actually change, in this case, below 103. So I can change and add like more reverb time on the kick drum and less on the snare drum. Or I could give it more power on the right, and more sustain on the snare. Making the kick drum almost dry. This is such a powerful tool, especially for bringing power out of the drums, where it's not just the amount of the signal that you're feeding in, but how you're controlling it. So you got a little bit there, and then we can also put stuff, add a lot of air to the top, or warm it up. I'll say somewhat neutral here. And then, of course, we could use the crossovers to kind of play around with this. Now, I'm going to take one step back here and go over here. So what I can do now is I can take and add a little, separate the drums. Right, so there, without the pre-delay, the reverb is more or less attached to the drum. Now, so that just immediately increases the size of the space. So it allows a little bit of separation there. Let's see if I move a little bit of the reverb even further. So this is a delay that delays not only the reverb tail itself, but also the early reflections. And this is just doing a delay on the reverb tail, which would be in addition to the pre-delay. So you can hear how you can really like shape and kind of build and add a lot of depth to the space. Now, if we want to play around with it, and because this is kind of tight, we may not hear a lot of what's going on here. We can also modulate detail. And this is kind of really would be better demonstrated in something like a vocal, where what you get is how does the shape of the tail move? So reverberant energy is not consistently the same in a natural acoustic space. It will vary based on how it's excited, where it's excited from, and how those waves and interference patterns and the way that they work. So so what you have here are some parameters that allow you to select different modulation types, and so this can sometimes add a little bit of character. So I'm not sure this is going to do a whole lot here, but let's just see. So it has a subtle effect. And you can kind of play with that again if you have more tail. This is like the reverb modulation. I'm sorry, this is a reverb modulation and a space modulation. The reverb modulation is just basically an LFO pattern that kind of work within the reverb itself, and the space modulation is more about the air movement. And so you can kind of play around with this as well. All right, so that can actually kind of help to shape it, and then we can or you could just turn it off. So you can hear a little bit of the effect here in this, but you can see how basically this works. And you could take any of these parameters, like if I wanted to kind of play around with this, you know, with any parameter that maybe doesn't show up here that I wanted to bring around. Let's say I wanted to take the early color here. I could hit the fader assign, grab the parameter, drop it onto the slot that I want it to exist on, and then that'll show up. So I can call up the parameters that I use the most, do that, and then go in and save that as a preset. Just hit the save as, store it, and then it will show up under user presets right here. So you can do it that way, and then you got a bypass control here, but really amazing plugin. I mean, this is just calling up one thing just for one sample, just to kind of, I wanted to do this just to give you a basic idea of like how much control and tweakability and how powerful it is. Like a really incredibly well thought out reverbs. TC Electronic has been doing this for a while. I've used the System 6000. It's really amazing. There's lots of good stuff in it, and I guess one of the problems with the hardware is that you can't put as many instantiations, quote unquote, as you can. And now the fact that this is available in native form and you have a lot of that power available to you here in your DAW, it's pretty amazing. So I kind of picked this plugin up recently and put it up, and it's like, wow, okay, this is really cool. There's obviously a lot that you can really tweak and kind of work with, and that is why it is Mixing with Mike, excuse me, plugin of the week, TC Electronic VSS3.